We have a special panel for you this evening. Um, I want to start by saying this panel is a wonderful addition to our readings, a complement to our readings, both The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson and Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. You'll see how this panel will expand on and further develop some of the questions, ideas, and teachings that are in both of those books. And I'll start by saying human beings have moved around as part of our existence from time immemorial due to quests for food, stable living conditions, marriage, forced migration, slavery, war, famine, drought, disease, and many other reasons. In fact, my family immigrated to the US from Mexico on my father's side and from Ireland on my mother's side. Movement and migration was even built into the work that my family did. My great grandfather and grandfather worked on the railroads north out of Mexico, and my grandmother's father was a laborer building roads in Mexico. The whole family ended up working to make steel in the mills of Northwest Indiana, steel that was used for rails and cars and bridges and ships. Though moving has been part of our histories, there are differences in our migration stories due to different levels of access and different dangers in both the places we've left and the places we've come to. Today's panel focuses on Black, Latinx, and Native perspectives on migration. We have with us today Kendra Aguilar, Kiara Daniels, Christopher Paul Jordan, and Maria Isabel Morales. A couple of our panelists will join us a little bit late due to some work requirements that they had, but they will be with us. Let me introduce all four panelists and ask our first question, and the panelists that are here can answer, and we'll just fold in the other panelists as they arrive. Kendra Aguilar is a descendant of Luceño and indigenous Mexican peoples. She is a graduate of Evergreen's MPA Tribal Governance Program, as well as the Native Pathways Program, NPP, where she currently teaches. Her work focuses on tribal food sovereignty and food justice, digital equity, and she is currently researching her own family's migration stories as part of her dissertation work around indigenous educational trauma. Welcome, almost about to be Dr. Aguilar. Also, this evening we will have with us Kiara Daniels, who's a proud Tacoma native, resident of Central Tacoma, and longtime community advocate. Growing up in Tacoma's Hilltop neighborhood, Kiara learned the importance of giving back and contributing to a strong community. Kiara graduated from Tacoma Public Schools School of the Arts, and then went on to the Evergreen State College Tacoma campus, and then on to earn her master's degree in public administration from the Evergreen State College Olympia campus. Kiara currently works as the Business and Community Development Coordinator for SpaceWorks Tacoma, a program of the Tacoma Pierce County Chamber of Commerce. There, Kiara leads the Hilltop Business Support, aiming to secure space and resources for Black businesses in the Hilltop Business District. In addition to her work with the Chamber, Kiara demonstrates her passion for housing, economic justice, and community-centered design through her research through her leadership as a core member of Fab 5, helping to lead the hashtag Design the Hill initiative. Last year, Kiara was awarded City of Tacoma's Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Emerging Leadership Award for her commitment to service, and describes all of her work as her love letter to the city. We're also joined this evening by Christopher Paul Jordan, who is an artist living and working in Tacoma, Washington, USA. He makes paintings, sculptures, and installations as time capsules for displaced folks to hold, bury, connect, and reintegrate our stories. Christopher Paul Jordan says this about his work, quote, "I'm interested in the afterlife of memory and shared experience, and in particular, how oral tradition functions, persists, rests, evolves, and endures in conditions of diaspora. My studio practice deals with continuums, analog internets, infrastructures of knowledge and care, and technologies for corresponding with locations beyond reach," unquote. And finally, we have with us Dr. Maria Isabel Morales, the daughter, granddaughter, and great-granddaughter of Mexican migrant workers and a first-generation bilingual immigrant herself. Maria Isabel Morales is currently a member of the faculty at the Evergreen State College. Morales teaches in cultural studies in education, Latinx studies, and political economy. She draws from intersectional analysis and critical pedagogy in her teaching inside and outside the classroom. Collaborations with indigenous and immigrant children and youth in Washington State and in Oaxaca, Mexico, have taught her critical lessons about sustainability, community, and love. Dr. Morales is also the faculty of Gateways for Incarcerated Youth this year. I want to welcome all of the panelists. Thank you for being with us. And I will offer our first question. Panelists, and I'll put it in the chat as well. Where did you grow up and how did your family get there? What were the social, economic, political, and personal forces that led to this movement? Which of our panelists would like to begin?
I could start. Kendra, thank you, Kendra, and others. Thank you, Dr. Zaragoza, and all the faculty and colleagues at the Evergreen State at Tacoma, and to all y'all who are here with us in this Zoom sphere. It's an honor to be part of this conversation. I know inspired me to think through and reflect a lot about my own story. So thank you for the opportunity, really appreciate it. Where am I from? How did I get there, right? I am from the place I was born, Michoacan, Mexico. As Dr. Zaragoza names, I am I'm an immigrant in this country. I'm a 1.5 generation immigrant, meaning that I came at the age of 5, right? So I was too young to kind of have the same experience of a first generation immigrant, and it's different experience from a second generation immigrant. My family, as far as I know and followed stories that have been shared to me, has been in Michoacan, in this state for many generations. This is one of the largest states in Mexico. It's sort of the coast on the Pacific. It's also one of the largest sending states. A sending state is a state from from which immigrants in this country come from. So it's a lot of folks that from Michoacan have historically continued to leave, not just within the country of Mexico, but to the United States. It's also a state with a huge rural population, mountain people. My family, we live in the mountains, work the lands, farm working has been in my family since even before I came to the United States. I was born there, and then when I was 5.5 years old, my brother and I and my mom, we immigrated to the United States. My father had already been in the United States. He would work in California and then he would go back to Mexico for a few months. And that was just his journey, just like his father and just like my mom's father as well. When I was 5, my mom was done living in that way. And it was my mom's initiative that said, hey, we need to leave. Actually, my dad, now I know, didn't really want us to come. That's a whole nother story and a whole other conversation. But like in my mom, like I think a lot of our immigrant families, the women take initiative and leadership, and it was her decision for us to leave. So we came, my brother and I came as my uncle's children, and we had cousins about our same age. And my mom crossed with my father and a coyote. My dad knew how to do so, so they crossed. So we were separated. We flew together from Michoacan to the border. And then we were separated. My 4-year-old brother and myself went with my uncle, my mom's oldest brother. And then she went with my father, and they crossed through the mountains. And I remember very clearly coming to a point and seeing the lights of the migra, the border patrol. And I remember the fear I had. And I remember telling myself, I better say that's my uncle, or they're going to take me to la cárcel, to jail. And all these things that the adults had told me as a kid. We crossed successfully. And days later, we were reunited with my mom, who also thankfully crossed successfully and went through her own long journey of crossing and running through the mountains, and all the fear that she, like many migrants, experienced while crossing the border in that way. I lived in California. I lived in the East Bay area of California, Fremont, Union City, Hayward, from the age of 5.5 up to when I was 16 years old. My father's side of the family lives in the Bay Area, and we lived there. And then when I was 16, my mother's family, who lives in Washington State, in Central Washington, invited us to come to Washington. And it was a response and invitation from all the struggles we were experiencing. We were struggling in California. We could barely make ends meet. Things were getting really difficult. Rents had gone up, and we just couldn't live, especially after my uncle's family, who we always shared housing with, had to move out. So we couldn't survive, and my mom's family reached out a hand, and they drove in 2 trucks from Washington down to California. We packed all that we could in 2 trucks. My brother, my sister, myself, my mother, we came up to Washington State, and my father rejoined months later. And so we came and we settled in Cashmere, Washington, which is a small little town in between Leavenworth and Wenatchee. Many folks recognize Leavenworth because of the tourism and the Bavarian village, and all of that. So that's where home is. That's where my grandparents are, my uncles and aunts, and my mom, in Cashmere, Wenatchee area. And so I am from all these different places. I'm there, and I am also now here in Tacoma living. Been here for a year now, but living in Western Washington for a few years. So these are the different territories, and this is in a nutshell my journey, kind of moving up north. But even before I did that north, flying up north like the butterflies, the monarch butterflies, we trajectories, and we fly up north. My grandfathers, then his generation, their generation, my great-grandfather also did that. And I know that my great-grandfather recently found a picture that you put together this story that he did work in steel work in Indiana in the 30s and 40s. And so he was a guest worker. He was one of the many and hundreds of Mexicanos who were hired by the United States to do work, up here. And he never we settled, his family stayed in Mexico. My grandfathers on both my mom and dad's side were also guest workers, and they also were hired in agriculture, particularly in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to do work from Arizona, New Mexico, California, up to Washington State. My grandfather, we finally decided to stay in Washington State on my mom's side in the late 80s, early 90s, and chose Cashmere because he felt that town was, he said it felt comfortable for him, and he knew the community, and he had some siblings that had already lived there, cousins, and so there was a migrant network that had already built and established in the Cashmere, Wenatchee area. So my grandfather decided to settle there. So I do come from many generations of immigrants. I am an immigrant myself. And so where I'm from all these places and all these stories.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to invite Kendra Aguilar onto the mic, but I also want to invite our learning community. If you are able to and feel comfortable, please come on camera and let our panelists, our guests, and our whole learning community see you this evening and see each other. We are so distant from each other. It's always nice if we can see each other and be in the space together. So please, if you can and feel comfortable, come on to the camera and let us see you. If you're eating, we understand. Maybe you come on afterwards. Thank you so much. I'll turn it over to you, Kendra. Thank you so much for being with us.
Yum. So hello, everybody. And, you know, yes, thank you for having me. It's an honor to get to be here with you all tonight and share some of my family's story and just be in community with you. So a little about me. I was born in Tacoma, which is the ceded territory, ceded lands of the Puyallup Nation. I was raised the first part of my life on Bainbridge Island nearby, which is ceded lands of the Suquamish. And I currently live and have lived in Seattle for a couple decades now, and on and off through childhood as well, which are the unceded lands of the Duwamish. And how I got here, and how my family came together, I have ancestors that are both indigenous to these lands of, you know, the United States, West Coast, and who came from all over the globe. My mother's side, we're mostly Scottish and Welsh, and when they came over, they ended up in the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. So they are mountain hill folks. They lived a really rough life for many generations. There's a lot of violence and a lot of hard times, and my grandfather and his family ended up moving up here to the Pacific Northwest for some of the many opportunities that you know, we're here for folks for jobs. I don't know very much about that side of my family. My dad's side, my father's mother descended from German nobility, and they fled Germany to the US in early mid 1850s, seeking asylum. They'd been exiled because my family had progressive political leanings, and there had been a sort of a failed revolution that occurred. And so anybody who was, you know, kind of siding against the current government were no longer safe to be there. So they all came over then. About, I think it was like 21 family members in the party who came over, and they ended up in Texas. And eventually our particular branch of that family moved up to Washington. You know, they had a lot of money at the time, and they ended up owning the water rights to Mercer Island. Right before Mercer Island kind of boomed, before they'd built or created the ferry systems to get everybody to be able to travel back and forth between Seattle and Mercer Island, they ended up losing a lot of money in that and in stock market and all that. And so we lost our family fortune, we lost our family titles, all that good stuff. But that was sort of the life that my grandmother grew up in. And then she ended up marrying my father's father, my grandfather, who is indigenous Mexican. His ancestors were from the Sonora area, and Soboba Band of Luiseño, which are one of the, you know, many tribes of Southern California. And so, you know, the way that they met and married each other, which is a very unlikely coupling at the time. And as many of us know, it was still illegal in many states for such a union to take place. So they were rebels of the time, I guess. Oh, what people do for love. But my grandfather, my native grandfather from California, came up to Washington because he was orphaned as a young boy and sent to the Sherman Institute, which was an Indian boarding school in Corona. And, you know, so he was basically raised there. And he is actually a descendant, so he's a boarding school survivor, but he's also a descendant of survivors of the California mission slave system, which was, you know, a system of 21 missions in Southern California that were built by the Spanish. and it with the purpose basically of, you know, assimilating and converting Native Americans to Catholicism, and of course expanding the land in the interests of Europe, you know, in the name of Spain at the time. And so, but they were very detrimental, of course, to the indigenous peoples of the area. And so it plays a huge part in our family sort of legacy and trauma. But my grandfather, once he graduated from the Sherman Institute, there was no work for Native people in California. There'd be signs in the windows that said Indians need not apply. And this was in late 1920s. He did get a little work for a while. This is kind of a fun family story, being the stand-in for several actors in Hollywood who would play, you know, famous gangsters in some of those movies. So he got stand-in work, and that was one of the only industries or places where Native folks were getting jobs at all. But usually they were behind the scenes. And so he ended up going to college on the East Coast and getting scholarships, and again coming back not having work, so made his way up to Washington State to eventually get a job with the Army Corps of Engineers up in Alaska. And that's how he ended up meeting my German grandmother, who was living in Washington with her family. And when I think about all of the unique experiences that my various ancestors had to have happen to make it so that I could be here, or that I am here, it just blows my mind. But then I think about all your ancestors as well, right? We all have these unique stories here in America. And I always think of you, Dr. Shepherd, because of what you said a few years back. But just when we gather in spaces like this together, you know, I think of our ancestors. They're here with us. And I know when they see us gathered in community in this way, they've got big smiles on their faces. So I like to think of that when we gather together in this way. So that's just a little bit sort of about me and how my family came to this area. And thank you.
Thank you. And I want to welcome our third panelist, Christopher Paul Jordan. Thank you so much for being able to join us. And I cannot tell you how perfect the timing is. You are up with our very first question. And it is, Chris, where did you grow up and how did your family get there? What were the social, economic, political, and personal forces that led to this movement?
Hey, everybody. So glad to be here. Thanks so much for having me. And I really appreciate your patience. Sorry, I was just coming from the city council meeting, and I want to honor Dr. Shepherd's work, which deals in part with how, when we talk about displacement and migration, we have to remember the folks who are invisibilized into incarceration and into systems of policing that are really foundational to how our communities become gentrified and displaced in so many different ways. And so unfortunately, our city needs a lot of work. And I just came from our city council meeting, which was a reiteration of how much work our city needs. So, but more on that later. I come from a family which has migrated to Washington State from the Southeast, from Florida. My parents grew up in Cocoa Beach and Daytona Beach, Florida. And, it's interesting. We ended up here in Washington State because my father felt called upon to serve and support the ministry of a really small church here on Hilltop, right across the street from Al Davies. And, it was interesting because it wasn't just that we moved to where we are, but we were sent for, we were called to come and be a part of this community. And obviously this was before I was born. but thinking about how Black communities also work together to create livable spaces, how we understand the constant duress that our communities are over and everywhere in the Western Hemisphere. And so when we find a place with any degree of solace or of any degree of respite, we reach out for our folks and try to help support them to arrive. And it's become a really fundamental part of how I think about our work with Design the Hill and our work in organizing for housing and connecting our community is sending for our people, creating spaces that are livable for our folks, for our elders, for our youth to be and thrive, and collaborating together to make it so that folks aren't just being pushed around everywhere, but have a place not just to leave, but a place to come to.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate that response. And I really appreciate the idea that incarceration is a kind of forced migration. That is really genius. I really appreciate that, Chris. Thank you. I'm going to go on to our second question. And after this question, we will take questions from our learning community. So please start to formulate some of those questions. What I ask is that you put your question or let me know that you want to ask a question in the chat directly to me in a direct message to me. That way we can organize the questions and get folks in line. This morning, we had lots of questions and I just want to be sure we do our best to get to everyone we can. So if you've got a question from our learning community, please direct message me in the chat and we'll get you on the list. Thank you so much. On to the second question. How does migration play a role in your life and in your work? And we can begin with whoever on the panel would like to start.
I think earlier, I think I hadn't thought about this, but earlier a student mentioned this kind of something that got me thinking about this question in a different way. And I think about that it's impacted sort of the ways that I relate to community and my commitment to just centralizing relationship in my life, to community, to family, and knowing that as someone that has moved, like in my own life, I have moved around a lot. And I just, with the stories I said earlier, the different places going from Michoacan to California to Washington, but just even from house to house. When I was in college, I would move like every 2 years, something would happen. I would have to move. I was moving around a lot. I went to grad school, I was moving around a lot. So I've always kind of had this like, just thinking about like, what does it mean to be in community, right? To live in community, especially when I haven't lived in a place long enough to like build sort of these connections that like other folks like around me have built, you know, to that particular land and territory and like landmarks, right? And so to me, it's meant that community stories are central for those communities, right? To build relationships. And that is what I kind of really connect to. So it informs the way and impacts me, the way that I perceive community and my commitment and love for building community, be it, you know, a community that exists like on Zoom, right? Because this is what we have, right? And my sense of belonging is also something that it's, I think many of us, we can agree that we're, you know, as humans, that we crave and desire and long to belong, right? And oftentimes a lot of the things that we experience in our life, like as children, as youth, right, in schooling or outside of school, almost always relates back to that. Like when we feel like we don't belong somewhere, right? Or we made to feel like we are not part of. And as an immigrant in this country that's also bilingual, right? Spanish is my first language. And that at home, like my family worked really hard so that I could really sustain this relationship to our food and in Spanish and the way that we speak Spanish, because not all Spanish is the same, right? My Spanish teacher in college in Eastern Washington said, that is not the right appropriate way of saying that in Spanish. We're like, well, that's how we say it in Mexico. And so the holding on to those stories. And so the sense of belonging and like always sort of being made to feel in the many microaggressions that I've experienced in my life, right? And questions that sort of interrogated whether or not I belong here. And not just in terms of like legal status, because that's also a thing. Like I have been asked if I have a green card. I have been asked like where my English comes from and where my accent comes from and where did I learn to speak so well. And so I've all those things I have heard. And even from grown people who shouldn't be asking those things, but I have. And so all those microaggressions, in addition to all the narratives and all those big stories and complete stories that are written and rewritten in those books and in the media about what immigrants are and what we look like and what we bring, and they're often informed and based on deficit thinking, right? And not looking at sort of the strengths, and not coming from these perspectives that are humanizing. All of that adds, to these questions of like, do I belong, right? So I'm always asking that question, and I always kind of been thinking and reimagining ways to answer it. And being in places like this where I learn from other folks of how people relate to this notion of community. So it informs in my personal life, and that I think it's just put me in a quest to build and rebuild and sustain relationships. And in the end, like that's the center, even to the professional work that I do, it's relationships, right? It's sustaining those relationships. In the classroom, I teach about this stuff, we think about immigration, right? And I think that because I have lived it in my own life, my own lived experience, that the conversations are centralize the stories versus kind of the theories, right? But both are important, right? And kind of ground the theories, and stories give life to theories, and theories also illuminate stories, and it's vice versa. It's that praxis, right, that we said earlier. So it impacts the way I teach, right? Where I want to continue to central and be open and to share my own experience and stories, and after sharing pictures of me, because I think it's an important way to counter those incomplete narratives of what immigration looks like, particularly Mexican immigration, and centralizing the human experience, that we have a right. I said earlier, we have a right to immigrate. It's a right? We've immigrated for many generations, like even before my great-grandfather came to the United States as a guest worker. And the connection I have to the lands of Michoacan, like I don't know much about my indigenous ancestry, but I do know enough that I do come from Purépechak people, right? The indigenous people of the Michoacan, and they moved around a lot. So it's been a right, and it is a right, but it's also kind of this really important right that I learned from the communities that I've worked with in Oaxaca and Mexico, and that is that many people are also fighting for the right to stay and for the right to not have to migrate, and really hold on, to those relationships, and stay in their lands, and stay with their neighbors and their families. And in my family, we have immigrated as a result of, political and economic situations, but also we immigrated to reunite and to reconnect with family. And while we have built a community here, like my family in Central Washington, I think we're enough relatives in Wenatchee to probably rename Wenatchee, because I'm not kidding you. My grandfather has about 10 siblings. Many of them still are alive and live in Wenatchee, and everybody has over 10 kids, and the majority live in Wenatchee. My mom is one of 12 brothers and sisters. I am the oldest grandchild of about over 40 great grandkids, and there is about over 40 grandchildren and over about 30 great grandkids, and the majority live in Wenatchee in Kashmir. So we have made a home, and that is, I consider that home. And I'm grateful for that. But the home that we also have built continues to kind of revolve around this sort of nostalgia and remembering what it meant to be in the land that our ancestors were from. Like we have each other and our family, and that's community, and I value that, and I love that, and I appreciate that so much. But we're not in the land, in the mountains and the ejidos, growing the corn that connected us and rooted us in ways that maybe other community members do, right? And these really important and deep ways. And there's always sort of this longing and this nostalgia that I feel when my grandpa tells stories of growing corn in the lands of Michoacan, right? And so that's immigrants, we don't have that, but we sort of make sense of that. And we try to hold on by creating and saying the stories about those stories, right? And keep telling them over and over again. And somehow we do have that connection, even if we're not literally in our bodies there in those lands.
Thank you so much. And we'll go to another panelist now. Really appreciate that response. Chris or Kendra, who would like to go next?
I'll go. I want to give y'all a little something slightly different than what I spoke about in the earlier part in this. And part of what I'm interested in is how Blackness destabilizes our concepts of migration, and destabilizes the ways that we can think about what it means to have a relationship to the land, to citizenry, to rights. You know, we understand that like our bodies are literally part of the GDP of this country, right? Like we understand that like physically, like, you know what I mean? Like we're physically a part of what this state is, of its foundings, of its potential. And and so when I think about that, and I think about the migration narratives that have been superimposed on the American story, you know, around people who had the potential to become white, and the people and around people who had the potential to assimilate and be involved in this government in this state in ways that are not possible for Black people. I really want to counteract the way that we think about migration by injecting conversations about marriage, and why maroon communities I think are so important in terms of thinking about Blackness, space, belonging, community, self-determination, is that this state and this government has never fortified our rights, has never fortified our survival, has never fortified our belonging, has never reinforced that. And maroon communities are especially inspiring and powerful to me because they represented a completely different social contract that Black community members created together, oftentimes in coordination with Indigenous folks, to build sometimes longstanding, sometimes temporary spaces of respite, spaces of existence, spaces of survival. And they had no trouble stepping outside of those spaces to wage war with the existing system and stepping back into it to return to home. Stepping outside of those spaces to trade with Indigenous folks and tell stories and trade tactics and then coming back home. Stepping outside of those spaces to share information with people who are still enslaved, and to imagine different pathways and different futures together. This is a consistent part of how Black people organized, and it's really central to it's central in a way that, but it's never discussed in what it means to be a Black American. It's never discussed in what it means to be because it can't, right? So I want to I want to throw that into the mix because I think it when I also think about the reasons why when we look at the city of Tacoma, you don't see recognition of Black cultural epicenter so crucial and so pivotal and fundamental as Hilltop. You know, when the space of Hilltop was, when our history in this neighborhood goes back to the 1800s, there's reasons why it was called the Nigger Tract. There's reasons why it's particularly devalued. There's reasons why, and I think for me, I'll tie this into Barracoon. I don't know if y'all talk about this book or connect with this book at all. Barracoon, The Last Black Cargo by Zora Neale Hurston was a documented surviving story of a formerly enslaved African who was the last known survivor of the transatlantic trafficking. And he, in the story, he talks about the systems of justice that Black Indigenous people had. And he talks about, but as you read the story and you come to understand that these people were trafficked as children, you know, as 7, 8, and 9-year-old children, that their entire parents, that their entire villages, all of their elders and parents and all of those people were slaughtered. And then it changes the way that you think about migration, and it changes the way you think about community building as a Black American, because so many times we are put in a position to imagine ourselves as trying to return to an imaginary home, trying to return to an African place, trying to return to another continent, to a place that we've never been able to know directly. And when in reality, home for us is the people that we are with. It's the people who came over. We are home. We are the only villagers from our village left. There was not, those people weren't, do you get what I'm saying? Like, and I know that there was many different stories and it wasn't always the same. And I don't want to give a single story to this, but I just want to emphasize that, that for Black Americans, we have to think about a different discourse around what it means to belong and how we constitute one another's belongings together. That's what I'm particularly interested in. I'm interested in how can we fortify that? How can we build that? How can we support that? How can we honor that? How can we coordinate? How can we design like that? How can we get down like that in every way, you know? So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much. We're going to now turn to Kendra Aguilar to answer that second question. And I also want to welcome Kiara Daniels, who's here. We'll let Kendra ask or answer the question, and then Kiara, I'll come to you and ask the first two questions and give you a chance to answer both. Thank you, Kendra. Go ahead.
I just want to thank my fellow panelists for just such powerful and inspiring words. It just, you give me so much to think about and respond to. And, you know, I agree. I was also thinking about, you know, belonging. And, you know, for me as someone who's Native American, if you will, although we had a conversation earlier today about what people call us and what we call ourselves, you know, which is a whole conversation to have. I mean, in the Declaration of Independence, we're referred to as merciless Indian savages. You know, that's a document that still stands, and you know, in the Constitution, you know, we have a different name. We struggle within our own communities, you know, when we think of our identities, how we want to refer to ourselves or ask people to refer to us. And, you know, on census documents, we're American Indian and Alaskan Native. You know, are we First Nations? Are we First Peoples? Are we Indigenous? Are we Native? Are we Native American? Or are we Pimcoicham, you know, which is the traditional word for my people. Luiseño is Spanish, you know, it means of the San Luis Rey mission. And I already spoke to, you know, how detrimental the mission systems were to us. So even though I still say Luiseño, it's so that other people know how to recognize who I am. But even saying those words is painful to me because it's acknowledged, you know, it's a continuation of that colonized system into my life. And I want to remove that as part of my healing process or repair process, you know, of this ancestral trauma that we carry with us as we move. And there is a lot of that trauma, and you know, part of how migration has impacted my personal identity is that due to the fact that my grandfather was orphaned and in boarding school and then had to move away to find employment. He couldn't even stay on his ancestral lands and be able to raise a family in that way. So he felt compelled to have to leave. And in doing so, he wasn't physically present when the tribe took, when there was a certain census done. And the tribe decided, a couple decades later, to use that particular census to establish the citizenship or citizenry for the nation. So in self-determination, and you were talking about that, Chris, self-determination, tribes, part of tribal sovereignty is self-determination, but they decided anybody not on that rolls and all their descendants would no longer be recognized as part of the tribe or the nation. So my family we weren't politically disenrolled, we were just erased, just not included. And that can be painful and complicated politically as a Native person, because that tribal enrollment status, the ability to say I'm an enrolled member of my nation versus I'm a descendant of my nation, which is what I say, or I say Liceño because that is not a particular tribe. We are many bands. And so, I descend from Liceño peoples, but I'm not an enrolled citizen. And that makes things complicated as far as, like you were saying, Dr. Morales, like how I show up in community and how I am in different spaces in community. And that's not a unique story to me. I teach for the Native Pathways program, which I also graduated from. And it's a story shared, with many of our staff, faculty, and students alike, where that it can be very divisive, and I'll save the blood quantum conversation for another panel, but it can be really complicated. And even right now, we see a lot of turmoil in community around that status. And folks, power, when we think of power and privilege, and there are folks who are getting benefits in the form of grants and funding for their art projects or whatever, in film and arts and literature, etc. That is meant to go to, tribal citizens. And it's going to folks who are claiming relationship where there isn't one. And it kind of leads me, I'm just thinking about what you're saying, Chris, and like this whole, like at what point does the land become your home, belong to the land? Because, we say in Native communities, it's not about who you claim, but who claims you. And so when I think about us moving and all this motion, we're peoples in motion all the time. And, Native folks also obviously had forced relocation several times. I mean, during the Dawes Act of the 1800s, and then again in the 1950s with the relocation and termination program, where they were really trying to eradicate tribes by moving folks off reservations to major cities on the coast mostly. And Tacoma and Seattle were both cities selected for that government program, where they gave Native families one-way tickets to cities with the promise of jobs and a new life, and didn't follow through on those promises. And so community, and again, I think of what you're saying, Dr. Morales, is that we, and you too, Chris, like we had to come together as community and build lives for ourselves. We have to take care of it ourselves for each other, just like we're doing now during this pandemic. I'm seeing it everywhere and it's so beautiful. But like you were saying, Chris, our communities have always been interwoven, right? And but there's a lot of repair that needs to happen, because there's a lot of untold stories and a lot of pain. I mentioned earlier today, I mean, there were tribes, not all, but there were tribes who owned slaves. And there's still today, there's so much work to do around, our Afro-Indigenous, Afro-Native, folks. And when we talk about belonging and rights, and rights to tribal citizenship, and it's very complex. But we've also always walked hand in hand, like you were saying, in a lot of ways. I mean, the American Indian movement was born out of the civil rights movement. We couldn't have done the work that we did without that groundwork and the support. And so we are connected. We owe a lot to each other, but we have to start telling our stories, and we need to bring them to light so we can begin to do some of the repair work and healing work we need to do to be able to continue and sustain this revolution. So, you know, again, we're just thinking about belonging and land and place. You know, I call this place home, even though it's not my ancestral lands. My ancestors are not in the trees, you know, and in the waters, and in our plant and animal relatives like other people's. But like you're saying, Chris, like this is, my heart is here, my people's here, my family's here. So this is home. And I do feel a calling oftentimes to return to like an ancestral place in some ways, but I'm still trying to explore and figure out where that would be and what that would mean for me. So what I do in the meantime is I build relationship with these lands, and that's something my husband and I actively work on. And you have to build that relationship. You have to do it with intention. Go out and introduce yourself to the land physically, and introduce your ancestors to the ancestors from this place, and just build that relationship. But yeah, again, using, you know, migration in my work, it same way as you, Dr. Morales, with students. It absolutely impacts how I teach and my positionality, my lens. And then also with the work that I do as a member of the Board of Families of Color Seattle, or folks here in Seattle. You know, again, it's about communities coming together and helping each other build safe, loving, supportive communities and places for children of color to grow up in. So that's kind of our goal, and we keep working on making it come together.
Kendra, I want to just also, there's something I want to say. I'm texting Kiara right now as we're talking, because what you said about the relationship between like Black liberation organizing and the American Indian movement, like I don't know about other folks in this room, but before you speaking this morning, I have never in my entire life ever heard any person say that, or let alone hear that from a Native person. So I just want to say how much mind-blowing it is to hear your acknowledgments of all these different forms of interrelatedness. And I want to acknowledge something. I call it a treaty of silence that I feel like exists between Black folks and Native folks about talking about the violences, about talking about the histories of how we have both worked together and how we have had deep, conflict. And so I think of it as a treaty of silence because it sometimes feels like it's too painful to speak to. But in thinking about imagining spaces where we can have those kinds of conversations, you know what I mean? Imagining spaces that are warm enough and loved enough and supported enough to hold like us and all of that. You know what I mean? I just really want to thank you for how you've spoken truth in this space, because it helps me to imagine that kind of space. And I get really excited about, because when we come together, like what?
Can you imagine? I know. But I love what you do as an as an artist. You know, art is one of, when things are, it means what you said, like when things are too painful to talk about, like we have other forms of expression, right? And like Dr. Shepherd with your film, you know, other forms of art. And I feel like art is that safe space where we can come together, and that warm, loving space to come together to begin that repair, that healing work. And so thank you for what you do. It's crucial for our survival.
Really appreciate that exchange. And I think you're absolutely right, Kendra. It is crucial for survival. So thank you both for highlighting that connection and the importance of the possibility of what can blossom from that connection, and that realization around that connection. I'm now going to welcome in Kiara Daniels, who is with us, and ask our first two questions of you. Then I will go to Dion Bonner, who has a question, and anybody else who wants to ask a question, please put that in the chat to me in a direct message, and we'll get you on the mic as well. And also just another friendly encouragement, if you can get on the camera, we'd love to see you. We'd love our panelists to see our learning community and be in the space together with us. So thank you. So Kiara, let me ask, where did you grow up? And how did your family get there? What were the social, economic, political, and personal forces that led to this movement? And how does migration play a role in your life and your work? Thank you for being with us.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, that is the longest. That's like, tell me your whole life story and tell me why you care about it. all in 2 minutes, respectfully, if you could, so we could move on. I just want to say first that I'm so proud of y'all for being here at Lyceum. It's 7:00 at night. I don't know what week you guys are in. Let's see, it's January. So that means you're probably in the beginning of the quarter. So we still have energy. I'm a 2014 alum and from Tacoma campus. And I was thinking about this today as I was thinking about how I started thinking about my journey here and what my story was and my migration story. And I would have never thought about my migration story, how anything about my life, if it wasn't for Evergreen and if it wasn't for having to write my memoir. And I think about, I'm a critical thinker. So, I think about, life circumstances and how we got here and why my family is the way it is and why we are fragmented and why it just feels like culturally we're lacking in so many things. And so when I was at the Tacoma campus, definitely Dr. Shepard's class for sure, it just took me on this whole journey of learning that, some of the things that went on in life are not my fault. They're not my family's fault. They are literally the predicament that we have been in. And so, and then that, got me further searching about what led to that and what led to that. And so I'm from Tacoma, Washington. I was born on Hilltop. I was born at Tacoma General in 1989. The height of what, folks, I guess what the newspapers will tell you what the Hilltop is. My grandmother my mother and father, grandmother, my whole family is from East Oakland. And they moved down here when things got crazy in the 70s in Oakland, California. I had uncles that were joining the Panthers, and my grandmother's son, which is my uncle, said he wanted to join. And my mom was too young to join, but she was definitely starting to read Soul on Ice and other things. And she was like, no, ma'am, we're leaving. My kids will not be murdered. My kids will not be murdered. And so she came out here not knowing that the movement was going to be here and that we would have our own set of problems here. I never got to meet my grandmother. She died when my mom was 18. But me learning my story and asking questions about where I come from allowed me to engage with my elders in a way that I don't think that they had even engaged with their self. So I asked my mom, well, why did we move from Oakland, right? She loved Oakland. And every time I go back, I'm like, this is the best place. It's so sunny. There's so much cold. It's like Tacoma, just like times 10, right? Where there's a little bit spicy. So I'm like, seems like it's the place to be, right? But what would make someone pack up her 3 kids and leave 3 there and move all the way here, and start a new life in Tacoma where she knew no one? And I think about what was going on at the time, right? And what led her to have to do that. And a lot of times we don't talk about police brutality when we talk about displacement. We don't talk about social movements. A lot of times, Black families, we want our kids to be smart. We want them to have their own voice, but we really don't. We want them to be involved, but we don't want them to be involved in the point that they're public enemy number 1, right? We don't want them to be murdered on the streets. We care about the movement, but not that much, right? Like we want we want to keep them alive. And so that was her motivation for moving here, and in addition to resources and increasing costs in Oakland. So When she passed, she left my family 2 houses. We had one on 25th and Yakima, down where there are now condos looking over the downtown. And we had one on 19th and Mason, which is right by Tyler, by Foss and the Central Tacoma area. That's where I grew up. That's where everybody in my family grew up. And it was, let's see. So I mentioned the condos that are, that kind of like, that came in, which is how we lost the house on 25th Street on Hilltop. But my house was the one in Central Tacoma, and we lost that in 2008. And so that really, to the housing crisis, right? And that really like was the end of what we knew our kind of cultural family experience to be. We kind of drifted apart at that point, and we didn't have place. That was the one thing that we knew that was stable in Tacoma, because, you know, we had migrated from Oakland. So that was the one thing that we had that kind of kept us together. Absolutely. It was Big Mama's house. Everybody in the whole family stayed there. Like, you know, we had the base, my uncle stayed there, my cousin stayed there. Everybody takes a turn, whoever it is, whoever don't have a house right now, this is where we're staying. And so when we didn't have that, our family really became like really fractured, and we didn't have gatherings anymore. We didn't have the things that kept us together. And so when I think about our work, circle back to our work, right? I don't know, Chris, if you have already explained Design the Hill, but we co-collab on that. And our work on the Hilltop is so much cultural. It's so much about like the physical building, but it's also about the experience of being able to gather, the experience of being able to be alive and be Black together and be in the same space. And that was very much taken away from us. And when I think about the loss that, you know, other folks go through when their families become fragmented, when they have to move away from the Hilltop, it means that we no longer go to the same deli, we no longer go to the same grocer, we no longer go to the same places that, number one, give us accountability for each other. Number two, give us like, when we have bad days or when we think we want to do, I mean, just everything cultural that encompasses like your institutions and your resources, right? Moving away from those, having to go to University Place or having to go to the South End or having to go to Puyallup really, really fragments. And I don't even think that we have come to the place as a society where we're even able to talk about that, because I don't know that we know what the repercussions of displacement are on a soft level, like on an emotional, psychological level, right? We know that we don't have our houses. We know that we don't have ownership over anything, but what does that mean to us culturally? How does that make us feel in the Pacific Northwest, that we already are 10% of the population in, or however many percent we are at this point in Washington? But how does it make us feel now that we are even more fragmented and we are one of one wherever we're at? And so our work with Design the Hill is, I'm sure Chris has already said this before, but it's so much about, it's about the housing, it's about the economics, it's about the culture, it's about the art, it's about all of the things that make us, and bringing that back and creating home in that way. And so I'm dedicated to that, and whatever that looks like. For my work, one of the things when we talk about displacement, we don't talk about is the loss of business and what that means to our communities and what that means when we go there. You know, we talk about it in light ways, like, you know we go to a new area in Seattle, or we go to a new area. We don't really have it quite yet here, but we know when we see a Whole Foods or we see a Sprouts that game over, we lost the hood, it's done. That's when we know we've lost it, right? And that it's not that we don't like organic foods, it's not that we don't like, these amazing places, but we know that represents the beginning of the end to Black business, to locally owned spaces, to places where we know that we can be safe, where we could be welcomed, right? And so my work at Spaceworks is to stabilize, to help to get resources to stabilize the businesses in Hilltop that are still there, and then to figure out how to bring more back, right? We have to support these young innovators. We have to support them to let them know, not just support them by feeling, but support them financially, support them with space, support them with everything that they need to be able to come back to make this back the cultural epicenter. And we cannot do that without business. So that's my work. And I hope I kind of traveled through the questions to be able to answer it all, but there's so much more to it. And, and thinking about, I know you all are thinking about, I don't know what you're thinking about actually, but in your studies, the one thing that I learned when I was in school was nothing ever happens like on its own. Everything builds on each other, right? So in our studies of gentrification, which is what I studied when I was at Evergreen, that was what I was going through. So that's what I wanted to study. So we would study transportation, and we would study gangs, and we would study loss of business. And there's so many things so many layers. And we learned that gentrification is not an experience, or gentrification and displacement is not something that happens within a year. This is planned 10, 20 years in advance, right? And there's so many things that build upon it to what you're experiencing at that moment. And so in order to combat that, or in order to fix that, you've got to build at several different layers, right? You've got to build to get people houses now, but you got to be thinking 10 years, 50 years ahead of where other people are thinking, and where other people are commodifying your space and your energy. So
thank you so much. I thought you did fantastic with those two questions and took us right through it in a really nice way. So thank you for your answers. Really appreciate that. We're now going to turn to Dion Bonner to ask her question. And again, I invite folks in the learning community to share your question with me in the chat in a direct message. And if you can, come on to the screen, let us see our learning community. Dion, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you. It's been amazing hearing these stories and everyone's journey. And I think you answered a lot of what I wanted to ask. I'll ask it, but I'm going to expand a little on that. What traditions have endured and changed because of your family's migration? And mainly, what are the cultural kind of benchmarks or things that have kind of helped you, grounded you in your current, environment?
And the first thing that comes to mind is for the second question. Thank you, Dion, for your question. So cultural benchmarks that ground you to your environment. Yeah. I just thinking, as soon as you said that, I thought about something we said earlier in the earlier session around corn and food. And certainly for my family, or for me anyways, that's it. Right? And I think for many of our families, that's it, right? Like our own, culture, we kind of develop our own cultural practices in our own households, even if, other relatives don't. Like there's also like all these layers to culture. But I think as a Mexican immigrant, this still very much connects to and knows Mexico and loves Mexico and returns to Mexico, and is Mexico's like in my stories. It's food, right? Things have changed. Yeah, we've come across, and I'm all the way up in the cold Washington state that I love very much, but it's still very cold. And eating tortillas, I'll say that, and corn, right? And and I didn't understand all of the stories and histories of corn until I had the opportunity in college to, read Dr. Rudy Acuña's History of Chicanos, right? That really talked about the corn and the corn civilizations, and, reading Gloria Anzaldúa and reading all these amazing historians. Like, I didn't know that. I just always knew there was something about eating tortillas that gave me a sense of like, it felt good. Right. And then I learned that, like, we've been eating corn for generations in Mexico, and a lot of Native people and indigenous people in Mexico and across the Americas. Right. And a lot of Mesoamerican cultures and civilizations in Mexico were developed corn. Right. And that was the cradle, right, of this civilization. Right. And so but I was really interesting because growing up, it was like I would grow up watching BS telenovelas that always kind of highlighted whiteness and like rich elite, and it was always real interesting. I never knew why this bothered me until later that I read back that whenever they showed, like in these like soap operas, which were very much a thing my family would watch, kind of progress and families being advanced, they didn't eat tortillas, they ate bread. And I always found out, like, I was always like, why? Like, I love my bread for sure. Pan dulce is great. But tortillas, like, I don't imagine me eating bread with my food. It was tortillas. And it wasn't until later that it was like, there's something like tortillas and corn in telenovelas. And reading pop culture is really important. Always represented poverty and indigenismo and indigeneity, right? And like only those, the othered, right? They ate corn tortillas, and those that sat in the big fancy homes and the tables, they had bread and white bread at the center of the table, right? And this is not talking anything about bread, but I think it's reflective, like these things also reflective, like the things that we want to reject, right? And the folks want us to reject. But in my family, like, I love eating myself. Every meal I have to eat a tortilla with corn tortilla. And it's just that reminds me of home, that it's home. That is a staple food in my house. Like, we don't eat much with silverware, but you eat with your tortilla, right? It's not, just kind of a meal that we eat every once in a while. It's like silverware, right? You use it, you eat with it, but it's also what's connecting. So through food and what we eat and the salsas and the various type of chiles it's not, it is not just popular to eat chile, but like we have been eating spicy, and it's part of like home and belonging, the food that we consume. And now knowing that like we have been consuming these things for generations, I think it's even gives me more reason to hold on to it. And it makes sense. Now it explains to me like why I just felt so home, so comfortable when I eat a rolled up tortilla and just some beans or dip in the salsa. That's all I need, right? So food, music, corridos, right? Corridos, I'll tap in the chat, but those are the kind of music that are like storytelling, like stories that are told in music, right? We listen, those are also things that we listen at home. So then as immigrant people here in Washington, family gatherings, we always are dancing to some corridos, listening, singing to them, eating these things, eating corn. And even though we add more things to our tables and we mix things, because that's what culture is, it changes over time. It's not going to stay static, right? But there are these staple things that we hold on to and connect us to home.
Absolutely. And I would admire that. I absolutely agree, and what you talk about, it just makes me think of that genetic memory that we all have. And, we kind of touched upon it earlier, but earlier today we talked about a lot, the fact that a lot of us don't know where our ancestral lands are. For various reasons, or even who our ancestors are, forced relocation, the stolen ones, Dr. Tate, and your work on the stolen ones, and in Native communities, some Native communities we call those children who we removed from their homes and adopted out to white families, the lost birds, so, similar stories there. But there's all sorts of reasons, why we may not know, and I it can leave us that sense of longing for that connection. And so and that happened with my grandfather being in the boarding schools. And for Native folks, it was illegal to practice our spirituality, our traditional ancestral spirituality, and our languages. We couldn't speak our languages. We couldn't don our regalia, which one of my students was saying her elders tell her that Your regalia is your ancestral body that you put on. And so things like, you know, those fibers and those plant matter and the animal, you know, skins or pieces that are part of that, you know, we lost a lot of that. We lost a lot of that. And you know, in the United States, there's almost 600 different completely separate tribal nations with unique individual cultures and languages and ways of being and knowing. And but what kind of has happened over the years in trying to rebuild and reclaim is there's been this sort of pan-Indianness, right, that has occurred. And like, you know, with like the powwow, like that's something very specific to certain peoples in a certain area, but we've all kind of adopted that. And part of that was because of the migration and the, you know, that relocation termination program where people from different places were moving to cities and coming together and building community as best we could. So we were trying to rebuild as a community. So we would just kind of, people, I wouldn't even say we adopted, people gifted their traditions to others, you know, and it kind of reminds me of like my husband's family and with the creation of Kwanzaa, for example, right? Like that longing for something that we can collectively as community, you know, feel represents us or feel like we're connected. And you know, I grew up because my grandfather lost all of his traditional ways, and then also because he was raised in the boarding school, and you know, the way migration impacts our relationships intergenerationally, he didn't know how to be a father. He wanted a family so badly because he didn't get to have one growing up, but once he had one, he didn't know what to do. He'd never been shown or modeled how to be a father, how to be in a family. And so he took work all around the globe. I mean, he lived and worked in Africa for many, many, many years. And then, you know, Korea and Vietnam and all over the place, to the point when I was growing up, I thought I was African because so much of our family culture was what he had been sort of gifted in his cultural exchange with the tribes in Africa that he worked with. So it was really interesting growing up and having my sense of who I was be very different than other people's interpretation of who I was. And that's a piece of this too, right? It's like what people's perceptions of us and what they put on us and their expectations for how we should behave or what we should connect with versus what we feel called to connect with. But I really relate to like that feeling of like, okay, so what connects me to my ancestors? And actually behind me on the wall, there's a couple things back there. That skirt that's hanging is something I actually, you know, had the opportunity to make a few years back so I could be in my cousin's wedding. And I went down to California to learn how to make that, but my teacher didn't come from my own tribal nation because those ways have been all but lost amongst our own people. We had to bring teachers in from Mexico, like the Kumeyaay and the Pai Pai people who, because we are, you know, that border was an invisible border, right? There used to not be, and our peoples were much more connected. And so there are our teachers now to help bring some of those customs and cultural things back to us. So there's stories like that all over the place where we're exchanging culture, or I'd even say it's almost like just gifting or lending culture while we're searching for what feels like connection to us, but that we absolutely have that genetic memory. And when you eat those tortillas, or like when I tried chia for the first time as a child, or when you hear certain songs or drums, or when I hear the bird songs of my peoples, like, you know, you're home. And so sometimes it's just a long journey to find those. And in the meantime, we share what we can with each other.
Thank you. Kiara and Chris?
Chris, you got it. I know Dion's not talking to me because we work together on this. So a lot of I lead a group of, on the hilltop, on Design the Hill, we lead a group. We facilitate a group of people from all different ages, from all different backgrounds on the Hill, different Black people with different ideas. And we figure out how every day or every time we meet, we figure out how we're going to connect with each other. And we had a lot of building to do with each other as different people from the diaspora. And Dion, you probably need to tell the people, because what's the one thing that we talked about, right? Like, what was the one thing that brought us together?
Wow,
In
there's
the beginning. Huh?
well, there were so many things, but I think it was some of the things I remember is our recollections of family time and celebrations and food.
The
And
cookout.
okay, yeah, the cookout, you know, these same things that traditionally it's a time of celebration, it's a time of togetherness and a closeness, fish fries. Yeah, there you go.
I think on the surface, these things seem so, they seem, I don't know, I guess, they seem so, not the word's not petty, but they seem so, I don't know, cliche, but really they let us know when we come into a building, and the icebreaker is like, what are you bringing to the cookout? There's just certain things that we know, like it's code for you're safe here. You could be yourself here. You can bring whoever you are here. We know exactly, based on what, if you're bringing drinks, we know where you're at with this lifestyle. Like, we know if you're bringing rolls and silverware, we know you're not really about this life. You are not there yet. You're not grown yet. You have not quite made it to be an elder. Right. And we know if you're in charge of macaroni and cheese and greens, as Chris seems to think he might be at some point, which I'm not really quite sure. That's TBD on that.
I have no interest in taking over greens.
No, he said he said he did some dish. We were like, I don't know about that. We're gonna have to see. We gonna have to really taste that just to know. I don't know if that's, you're a little young.
I'm all about the just the dressing for me. That's the only look.
Right. But there's those things that are that seem cliche, but really there are the things that connect us. And we could go, we could talk about that in Tacoma, but we could also go to Philly. We could go to North Carolina. We could go really anywhere. And the food, the music, the sounds of the drums. If you hear like a certain drum, we know, oh my gosh, we're home, or we smell incense, something, we're home, we're close to home somewhere, right? Like, there are things that let us know that we're close to safety. And I think those are survival tactics that seem cliche on the surface, but really there are things that are inside of us that that bring us closer together. Sorry, Chris.
You want to answer Dion's question? Chris, do you want to answer Dion's question?
Kiara got my appetite rolling, talking about greens and macaroni and cheese. Dion, I'm sorry, I forgot the question by now.
Dion, you're muted.
Oh, sorry. It was just generally about what cultural traditions bring you and help ground you that come from your family through the process of migration.
Oh, singing. Singing is really everything. Like I said, our family was we got out here because of the church. But in many times it's such a small church. I remember growing up 6, 7, 8 years old. Some Sundays, people be getting tired. They don't feel like getting up. I remember we was at church, just us. And it was just us little kids, the praise team singing. Like, you can imagine like a group of 6, like 7 to 14-year-old kids just standing in front of a group of nobody, in front of a group of empty pews and singing. So, our family, and I think of the songs, especially the congregational songs for me, have always been historic for me. They've always carried so much more than what's in the lyrics. And for me, like earlier, I'm not sure if it was one of the other panelists. I'm not sure if it was Miss Morales or if it was Kendra, but that talked about things in your backpack. Yeah, and carrying things in your backpack with you. And to me, those songs are those things. The songs are oral lineage, their connection back. And what's really interesting to me is like, that's kind of what I explore with my art, is basically this question of, you know, if we are if we're a relational community that builds knowledge and that creates our world through conversation, through dialogue, through oral tradition and connection, what does it mean when we're physically separated from our communities, when we're atomized and displaced and dislocated from one another? What does it mean to actually build and create home? How do you have oral tradition in the conditions of diaspora? That's really what I explore with my art. And I'm really interested in like infrastructures of knowledge and care that allow people to communicate and connect across space and time, in the midst of those of that atomization, in the midst of that displacement and dislocation. And so for me, I'm interested in, well, how do we embed that knowledge and those stories and that information and that experience into the things that we make and hold, into the spaces that we create together, into the neighborhoods that we live in. How do we create new timescales for our knowledge so that elders who are on the verge can share their knowledge generations down, and that knowledge can be traced back, you know? So that's what I'm like super curious about and interested in as an artist. um, and I'm going to share with y'all a link to something that I've been working on, which is called Piecing and Salvage. And it's about the cultural aesthetics of Hilltop. But what it does is it explores how our community's knowledge is embedded in the items in our surrounding physical environment. And it's part of a journey towards codifying like some of our values in terms of how they inspire the ways that we can build community in the physical landscape, into the architecture, into the buildings. But it basically, I just dropped y'all a Google Doc. You can literally comment on this document. It's like an open source, you know, research. And if you come in a year later, it'll have a year's more worth of research in it. But it's a document that tries to contextualize Hilltop in African American art history, and looks at like the pre-colonial kind of auspices of sorry, I hate to use that word, the pre-colonial like background and like context behind some of our the knowledge that has migrated with us, you know, and how that informs how we build and create. And Dion, I see your motifs all up in there. So if you look at that, you're gonna see your cousins all up through in that art and all in everything. But it's I think Dr. Morales earlier might have spoken about the tapestry, and that I got super excited when that came up, because it's so much a part of, you know, y'all just get you got me asking an art question, you get me talk forever. But I really believe that textiles, in relation to really what Kendra spoke about earlier, textiles become metaphors for who we are, and also metaphors for society, metaphors for our community, and how we come together. And it's particularly exciting to me looking at African American history and tradition and how it takes shape in the physical works that we create. So
Thank you, Chris. We are running short on time, but there are 3 questions left. I'd like to get all 3 of those questions in, have the questioners ask them, and then you 4 panelists can answer however you choose, aiming at any or all of those questions. So first, I'm going to invite onto the mic Candace Wheeler to ask your question. Candace, go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you all for definitely being here. Your stories are remarkable. I wanted to ask you all, since you guys are definitely from other places, so am I. I'm not from Washington, but I wanted to ask all of you, what is the first impression of Tacoma that you would like to give to others who are moving to this area, instead of the bad stuff that is always often told? Like, what is that one special thing that you would want people to know about Tacoma?
Good. Thank you for that, Candace. What is the good stuff about Tacoma you want folks to know? Now I'm going to invite on Tamara Davis. Tamara, go ahead and answer or ask your question.
I was listening to how families were slaughtered and children were kept to bring over. And I know that there were doctors and lawyers from Africa that were um, also brought over to America for slavery. But my comment, I think, was about African Americans that were brought over and how it affects then and today the culture and the family dynamics of African American and colored families. And, you know, another part of my statement is also about the loss of Black identity. I don't really like saying Black, but that's what everyone else says, because that is a word from Uncle Sam that says who we are. I believe we are African Americans and some with white blood in us and other kinds of blood, but the loss of identity of that nationality and culture as a human being, and also how there is a huge loss of information in the system of African American bloodlines, of African bloodlines. I didn't really want to say anything because this type of thing, when I hear about it, I have PTSD because of the color of my skin and how I've been treated. I'm 54 years old and I've lived in a little bit of that time of, you know, uh, being just a few in a white school and things like that, and the profiling and everything. And my children have just a lot of things. Every aspect of my life has been affected just from the color of my skin. And so that's just a statement that I wanted to bring up. Um, sorry about that. That's just a statement I wanted to make.
Thank you, Tamara. We'll see how the panelists address it. And finally, let me go to Paris Miller to ask the third and final question. And again, panelists can answer these questions as you're able. Go ahead, Paris.
So my question is, being born and raised on the hilltop, the dialogue, sometimes I think about who's not talked about. And so in essence, my question is, what applicable methods are used currently to re-educate the next generation to empower togetherness?
Excellent questions. I'll turn it over to you, panelists. You have 3 questions before you. Please answer as you're able.
I want to speak to the first question. I apologize. I don't remember the name. Who's first question? The question of Candace. Yeah, the impressions of Tacoma. And I want to speak to that because I am new in Tacoma. It's going to be 1 year living here. And I really love that question because like I every time I've been more than once that I've mentioned to folks from the area that I live in Tacoma, and the responses are always very interesting to me. They're always like, why are you living in Tacoma? And I'm like, what do you mean, right? And so then that starts this conversation, and I really appreciate you like asking that question. When I first kind of got the job here at Evergreen, I lived down in Lacey, and I lived there for a year, and I was kind of like, where do I want to live? I lived in Puyallup with my brother, and finally decided to live in Tacoma. And why did I decide to live in Tacoma? Because it felt so good to be here, and I just like there was one place that I used to go with some of the friends and relatives, and we just go and see other Latinos, and like just felt good. It felt welcoming. I felt like I could belong here, like it was a place that I could. I like that idea of tapestry. So that's the first impression. It was like I looked around, I was like, yes, I like Tacoma. I see other people here, other brown people here. There's music here. There's good food. The artwork, the murals around, like, I love Olympia. Not hating Olympia, but I didn't see myself living in Olympia. I didn't feel like that was where I needed to be. The stories walking around the campus that y'all have here in Tacoma, beautiful artwork. It felt good in my spirit. And so that's my first impressions.
That's what I thought of too with that first question, you know, what to know, what we want to offer people, you know, to pass on about what's great about Tacoma. I absolutely think about this Tacoma program, and, you know, how it also, it helped inspire, you know, our Native Pathways program, which used to be called the Reservation-Based Community Tournament Program, and the building of the Evergreen Longhouse. You know, once you see it modeled and you see how people, you know, it was done for the community, by the community. And when you see those things modeled, you know it's possible, you know, and that hope that it instills in you. And so driving by this camp, you know, the Tacoma campus, like you're saying, Dr. Morales, that beautiful artwork that it honors all peoples and all different stories and experiences, without speaking, right? And again, that's the power of art. And I just, I really, really love that. And then I think too of just, when I look at the Puyallup Nation and how they've been able to build and continue to build their nation up, and you know, that's nation building right in front of our eyes. You can see it from the freeway when you drive down the street. You know, you can't miss that big old casino and all the mass improvements, and that's a whole nother conversation, you know, for some time. But just the fact that they're nation building in front of us, you know, that's a beautiful thing to see, and be able to talk to people about. But that's also kind of part of that third question that Paris asked, about how do we teach the next generation, you know, and in a way that will inspire this togetherness and things like this, you know, meeting together. You know, what happened at the campus a couple years back between Puyallup Nation and Tacoma program and the Native Pathways program, doing a braiding ceremony together, which was a way to commit ourselves to each other in community. And we've continued to build and grow those relationships. And so making those commitments, growing it, and then seeing it manifested in some way, you know, I think that helps, yeah, keep the youth connected and inspired and hopeful.
Thank you. So I'll turn those 3 questions over to you two now and see how you want to answer them.
I just want to piggyback on the thing about with the Puyallup tribe too, of the, oh my gosh, what I love about it is it's such a flex.
Yeah.
Like you see this massive logo, the Puyallup Tribe of Indians, like it is a flex. When they designed it, they were not playing games. They were not being timid. Nobody was being timid. Nobody was holding back. They're like, you about to know where you are. And I love that. I absolutely love that. Every time I drive past it, it makes me feel bolder, you know, and how we advocate for space, and how we stand in space and hold space and create space for folks to really feel welcome and to feel their pride and their inspiration. Yeah, I just, anyways, when you brought it up, I just really wanted to say that because it just, I love how much of a flex it is. So I, you know, I just want to say to Tamara, I just want to transmit so much love over to you right now. You know, and just how honestly you're naming how it really hits us. You know, the suffering that has been and the violence that's been meted against our people across all these generations. And I just really appreciate you naming that. And you know, it's interesting that kind of there's this overlap to me between what you brought up in Paris's comment, because, or question about youth, because when I read that book Barracoon, and I started to think about how for a whole village, you know, everyone over age 12 having their life taken so violently, and then the children being trafficked. It really made me think in such a radically different way um, about both my Blackness and my Africanness, because I started to think about how a young person would preserve identity. I started to think about how a young person would build community and show love and know who they are, you know, and how they would witness those experiences, but also what they would search for. Um, and it just, you know, it's I think so many of the things that people seek to place comfort in or root identity in order to have a sense of confidence are about everything opposite to youth. They're about prestige, about formality, about control. And where for young people, these things culture and identity can be radically reinvented and transformed in every way. And I think it's part of why Black youth movements have really been the cornerstone of our civil rights action. Every generation has been led by youth. And I think that there's something about this space of young people existing radically, existing as whole people in the full complexity of who they are, and something about that space, which is the birthplace and the rebirthing in each generation of who we are remanifesting itself. And so I really appreciate you naming how heavy it hits to think about our youth, our ancestral youth experiencing those kinds of horrors. And in thinking about the life that they would wish for us, you know, as their descendants, and the joy that they would wish for us, and community that they would wish for us as we come together and support one another. That's what I'm meditating on right now.
So if I can jump into that point, by just kind of like youth and what the ways that they lead so many movements. I just wanted to like jump in that and rereading that question, Paris, of like applicable methods, right? That we can educate the next generation. I think that in many ways, younger generations are educating us and different other generations, right? I think it's both, right? There's like, I really love to kind of witness this way that you just gave Tamara, love, Chris, and right, and recognize like the struggles of different generations, right? And but I also want to say that I think we're also kind of learning a lot about like organizing and using, you know, all the resources we have, right, to organize and to build togetherness. I absolutely love that idea of togetherness. And I think in the end, it comes to that, like, how do we build relationship with each other, right, and with our own families and with ourselves, and build that togetherness. But just want to say that I know I've learned a lot about, I said earlier, of all the youth and cousins that I have in my own family. And there's conversations that we have kind of a social media family group with all the cousins and stuff. And I know that we have one particular aunt who says very problematic things. And there's times where I'm like, oh, as the oldest cousin, I think I should say something. And then like one of them come in and they'll say something. I'm like, oh, there's no need. Like they got it, you know, they completely, like at one point there's this whole conversation happening about, I don't remember what it was, but then we started talking about the ways that in a Latino community, there's a lot, like anti-Blackness is a real thing, right? And like the way that we like internalize racism and would perpetuate anti-Blackness in our communities. And this conversation happened, and this aunt was like saying things, and my cousin broke down Black Lives Matter and the ways of how it's important, how it inspires us to build solidarity and why we need to be in solidarity. Like, I was like, dang, like there's no, like they get it. And, you know, completely, you know, it just told like all the things she needed to hear. And so it was like, yeah, like they are breaking it down and they can name it in better ways than some of us. So absolutely, yeah.
I want to invite Kiara in to answer any and all of those three questions.
let's see, I'll just do the first one really quick about, I was born in Tacoma, so I have big Tacoma love, big Tacoma love. It's just important for me to understand my story of why my family is a little bit spicy, why there's not as many of us out here as everywhere else. And so, but me, my family is, I mean, once you've been here for 10 years, you are Tacoma, right? And so I'm 31 years in at this point, and I absolutely love asking people like, what is their hometown hero when we talk about like their favorite places in Tacoma. And for me, the places that are my favorite are the places that ground me, that have been here for over 50 years, right? Because it represents stability, it represents history. I think about the Caballeros, and I think about how my mom volunteers there and is a part of the board now. And I think about how that was started with 6 Black men mortgaging their houses, risking everywhere so that we could have place, right? And I think about the legacy that will be continued there, and how what I will look like when I participate there. I think about Bob's Barbecue. Like, these are the easy ones, but like, it's not just because I love barbecue. I don't really even like barbecue all like that, but I love the people there. And if you've ever been there and you've talked to Miss Kay and she tells you the story of her dad having a shop down on downtown, I think it's almost 100 years old. Actually, I know it is. It's almost 100 years old, if not 100. It's very close, right? Of her dad starting a business and then moving and then having this relationship with Robeson, and there's just so much history there. And when I go there, I get barbecue, but I get my lesson of like where we come from and how we have businesses. She tells me that's how I knew that beyond the internet that Hilltop was a Black epicenter for business. She told me about the tailor. She told me about the newspaper. She told me about everything, right? Like, beyond just seeing the fish house and seeing that legacy as a high schooler, and knowing the kids and seeing what business did for their family and how it elevated and created this infrastructure within their family and within the religion. Those are the things that I think about when I think about Tacoma. I think about this like ability, we call it the city of destiny. I think I lost that for a little while, thinking about the barriers that we face here. But I've been, in the last maybe 5-7 years, I've just been reinvigorated about, actually, we did have some good times here, right? We didn't just come out of the 80s and 90s and with nothing, and we actually had things, and if we had them once, we can get them back. And I think a lot about, Paris, to your question, who has been forgotten? And I think really deeply about the work that we do with Design the Hill, and how we talk about the history of the Hilltop. We talk about the 70s, the 60s and 70s, and how it was amazing. And then we breeze over the 80s and 90s, and we say that was the worst time, and we don't talk about why it was the worst time. We don't talk about what led to that, right? We don't talk about the closing of Nally Valley. We don't talk about the loss of the mass job loss. We don't talk about the crack that was put into our neighborhoods. We don't talk about the war, the soldiers coming home and not having anything to do. We don't talk about the things that have led to the mass like trauma that our community went. Gangs being the only thing that we had that actually was a culture of its own. So when we talk about bringing us back together, the Crips are not left out. They are a part of that. And we think about every day, like, how do we bring our family back? Because there's a lot of people that are getting out of jail that they're going to come home to Hilltop and they're not going to know. They're going to want to help to repair that. They're going to want to be a part of that. And we got to welcome them with arms and have a place for them to do that. And so there's just so many different components and so many different layers to making sure that we have home. Chris, you were talking earlier about the textiles, and I remember how many hours we spent on thinking about the marketing for Design the Hill, the naming of Design the Hill. We didn't say Design the Hilltop, we said Design the Hill, because that verbiage says something to people that that have been on the Hill for years that call it it's just the Hill, right? That says to you, this is for you. We need you here, right? We talk about like the colors that we use. We use the African, the colors and it's escaping me, right? But we use those
African flag.
things. Yes, to communicate this, we want your voice here. You are going to be accepted here. You are going to be prioritized here, right? At every different level. If you were here in the 80s, if you were here in the 90s, if you were a youth that was here in the 2000s, that was here after everything and kind of, it just wants to find place again. This is for you. And so I'm going to get off of my soapbox, but I've just been so inspired by just the questions and the thinking about how we recreate home, that I'm thinking about how we can do this better. And I'm thinking about how we can inspire other people to find it, even when it's been tomorrow, like taken from us. Like there's been so much taken from us, but we still have things that we can piece together, and we still have, there are still chances for us to piece together what we have and recreate things based on what we know and what we want to do now. So I will leave you all with that.
Thank you. Those are some deep and wise final words, Kiara. So appreciated. Thank you to Kiara, to Chris, to Kendra, to Maria Isabel for being with us today. I now want to transition to give back. And I think we've got time for about 5 give backs. So please, if you'd like to give back, raise your hand. We'll call on you. Yet again, it's been a real intellectual pleasure to see these ideas woven together, not only in the stories that you've told us, but also in the books that we've been reading, our other coursework, and all that we're doing as a learning community. You have enriched us most especially. So who would like to give the first give back?
I just want to say thank you to everybody on this panel this evening. This is probably, I really like Lyceum, but this is probably one of my favorite Lyceums that has ever came. I really just appreciate your honest, genuine selves that you brought to the table, your transparency, and honestly, the insight to not only just like the cultures that you grew up in, because some of them are very similar, some of them are very different, but bringing very insightful highlights to things that are overlooked very easily. I just thank you so much. This was an awesome panel this evening. I got a lot of great stuff out of this. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Krista. Let us go to our next give back. I do see that there are some in the chat, but I'd like to get someone on the mic. Davina says this was one of the best Lyceums, very rich. Bonnie Friend says, so beautiful, inspiring, motivational, heartfelt. Thank you all so much. Good job, everyone. Panelists from Tamara Davis. Learning community. Someone get on the mic and share.
I can go. This is Lakeisha.
Thank you, Lakeisha.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank all the panelists. As Dr. Zaragoza was talking about, we've been reading about the Great Migration of African Americans from the South to the North in the warmth of their suns, and then Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower. And I see so many connections between the migrations that you all have talked about, from Mako to other lands to the indigenous lands here. And that to me is like beautiful as the monarch butterfly that Doctor mentioned. So I just really appreciate how enriching what you all have spoke about has enriched the learning that we're learning about in Lyceum and in other classes. So I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Lakeisha. Thank you so much. One
Hi,
other.
Dr. T. This is Mia Anglin.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mia. Come on.
I am so late and it was beating myself up. Like when I logged on and I heard this, I was like, no, because it's been a long day. But I text my mom. I was like, Mom, what year did Grandpa, move to when you come to Seattle? Like just thinking about it, listening to Kiara, and just that history. So that was all I got and I made it. I'm just so grateful and thank you guys.
Thank you. Let us go to Dr. Bacho for the faculty give back. Go ahead, Dr. Bacho.
This morning's presentation was wonderful, and you're to be absolutely commended for doing double duty today and coming back in the evening and holding up. It's been a long day for all of you, and presenting a presentation, a discussion that was equally involved, passionate, and thought-provoking. You have enriched us as a community. You've made the process of seminar, which we're going to go to in about 15 minutes, just an easy thing because your presentation dovetails very nicely with two of the best books that I have ever read, assigned for the quarter. The Warmth of Other Suns, and what's the other one? The Warmth of Other Suns, and the Sower's Parables, the Sower, Parable of the Sower. Brilliant books. One, of course, is literature. The other one is a magnificent history. And you have added so much to the discussion, and you have enriched us all. And thank you, particularly since, again, you are doing double duty, and the energy of tonight, when we're expected to tire out just a little bit, it was all there. And it inspired our students. It inspired everyone who was present. And we, as the faculty, thank you all very, very deeply.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bacho. I'm going to give the last give back to Natasha Lemke. Natasha, please offer your give back.
Yes, I want to thank the panelists again. Like Dr. Bacho said, it was equally as rewarding to attend this evening also. I think for me, the thing that stood out is that for folks like myself that don't have a deep-rooted history or a knowledge of my own family history, I think it was a reprieve to hear and to recognize that just because I don't know what my history was doesn't mean that I can't create and build that history for my daughter, and building new traditions and thinking about the importance of the matriarch and how those are roles that we can take on. They don't have to be assigned to us, and that it's as simple as coming together with food, and it's as simple as coming together with music. And I mean, these are things that as human beings, we enjoy these anyways. But to share them in a common space with people that we love and adore, and for people that we want to get to know more, isn't as difficult as we sometimes make it seem. We make it seem like it's this far-fetched idea, that it's an intangible thing and it's too much weight to bear. But you've also just shared with us how simplistic it is and how meaningful it is, and how it's those things that you remember as time goes on. So thank you for making that really easy for us and really pushing us, post-COVID, to return to those things and to love on one another, because it is tough, it is rough out there, and to come into a space where we're together with the people who have our best interests at heart is what helps us heal and grow and to release from that trauma. So thank you so much for sharing your stories with us and reminding us that we can build our own memories. They don't have to be written down somewhere.